Hey folks, Zach Osterman, are you Insider Indianapolis Star? I don't know what we're going to call this, just a check-in, I guess. We've kind of gone radio silent here for the last few days, just recharging, obviously powering down around the holidays, spending time with family, but Indiana reopens, I should say, Big Ten play tonight. We're talking at a little after noon on January 3rd. Indiana at Nebraska tonight. I'm not there. Mike Nizilik will be there. We split up some of these road trips between us. So obviously I'll be following along from home, but just kind of, I guess, a check-in on where Indiana is. Hoosiers are 10-3. They are 2-0 in Big Ten play. Obviously a non-conference sort of slate that probably left just a little bit on the table in terms of not adding any kind of, high-quality NCAA tournament wins. You will forgive Mo flopping around on the couch back there if you can see him. The flip side is Indiana is at the point of its schedule where it is allowed to say it's 2-0 in the conference, and it's 2-0 having beaten a Maryland team that's just steadied itself a little bit, really caught, I think, Maryland at a good time back in early December, but the last night's loss to Purdue notwithstanding, I think Maryland has kind of found its footing again. And then a win at Michigan that is probably going to stand up as a quad 1 or quad 2 all year, and is certainly, at least I think you're allowed to be encouraged by it. And I think what's interesting in the big picture, and we'll drill down to Nebraska in a minute, but what's interesting in the big picture is kind of what Indiana's got kind of right out of the gate here. They're at Nebraska, they host Ohio State, they're at Rutgers, then they host Minnesota and Purdue, and that takes them through January 16th. That's their first 5 games after the restart. There's 3 home games in there. KenPom currently has them as the underdog in 4 of those 5 games, but the only one of those that KenPom's got them as an underdog by more than 7 points is Purdue. They're a 12-point underdog in that game. 3 of those 5 games, they have at least a 37% chance of victory. Again, 3 of those 5 are at home. And there is a path here to Indiana, genuinely, if it can find its way to beating Nebraska tonight. I do think there's a path to being 5-1 in the conference when Purdue comes to town on January 16th. And 5-1 would also mean, presumably, for example, beating an Ohio State at home. And then suddenly you've got a couple quad 1, quad 2 type wins. You've obviously put yourself in a good position from conference, sort of the conference standings, from the position of the conference standings and where things are there. And you set yourself up, obviously, an opportunity to try and pull another upset of Purdue that would stand as a high quality win. That's the big picture, and that's probably an optimistic scenario. That's an optimist scenario, no doubt. It's not, I don't think, outside the realms of possibility if Indiana can win tonight. And Nebraska, it's weird to say that the first game after the restart is a swing game, but you got a situation where Nebraska is on the one hand a team that I think historically, Indiana's done well against since the Huskers have come into the conference. On the other, Nebraska's been a decent team. They got they're 2-2 against quads 1 and 2 this season. If Indiana were to win tonight, it would be a quad 1 win. Indiana at the moment doesn't have a quad 1 winner. I think Michigan is fair. I think Michigan is 75th in the net right now, which means Michigan is at the absolute outside edge of a quad 1 win. That would add a second one. That would give Indiana 2 wins on the road. And listen, Nebraska and Michigan may not be tournament teams this season, but in the bigger picture, and we talked about this a little bit before Christmas, there aren't a ton of tournament teams on the Big Ten schedule for anybody this year, certainly Indiana among them. You're going to have to do this with quantity a little bit too if you're Indiana and you're building out a tournament resume. You're going to have to beat a Nebraska on the road and hope that stands up as a quad 1 win. You're going to have to beat a Northwestern on the road, or a Northwestern at home and hope that stands up as a quad 2 win. You're going to have to try and find your way to, maybe a Maryland away, a Michigan State at home. Some of these wins will come against tournament teams if Indiana does it right, if Indiana can kind of chart its own course through this thing. But there's also going to be an extent to which Indiana is going to just kind of have to pack its resume with quantity and say, hey, Nebraska may be in the field, may not. Michigan may be in the field, may not. Maybe a Rutgers is in the field, may not be. But those are still quad 1 wins, or at worst quad 2 road wins. on an NCAA tournament resume that is not just going to, unless Indiana does something like sweep Purdue again or, beat Purdue, Ohio State, Illinois, and Wisconsin all at home. I guess it only plays Illinois on the road, but wins maybe the Illinois game on the road and then beats Ohio State, Purdue, and Wisconsin all at home. The top line of the resume is not necessarily going to do all the heavy lifting for Indiana this year. There's going to have to be depth to it as well that obviously for a variety of reasons Indiana wasn't able to quite add in non-conference play. But the opportunity is there. The flip side is, and I kind of wrote this after the Kennesaw State game, the flip side is the conference is not that good. And there are, we'll look at this Nebraska matchup in a minute, but these are a lot of these teams have flaws, and Indiana's got some too, undoubtedly, but Indiana's also got some real strengths and some really individually talented players. And if Indiana can replicate that Michigan performance, just the right number of times on the road and then hold serve a little bit at home in conference play, Indiana should, I think, still be able to put itself in a position where it can be talking about the NCAA tournament field comfortably come late February and March. Nebraska tonight, the first question will be Xavier Johnson. Nothing firm or definitive on that. Obviously, we'd write it if we could. I would not be at all surprised if he plays, to be honest. I'm not guaranteeing he will. I wouldn't be at all surprised to see Xavier Johnson in some capacity tonight. And he would be an interesting add because I think Nebraska's a pretty good three-point shooting team now. I say pretty good, but they've got a couple shooters that can hurt you is probably the better way of putting it. They're statistically better offensively than they are defensively, but interestingly about their defensive profile, they are really good defending twos, and they don't put opponents at the free throw line. They're 16th nationally in free throw rate, or opponent free throw rate rather, and they're 21st nationally in opponent 2-point percentage. And I bring that up because those are kind of Indiana's core sort of pillars, the ability to finish well around the rim and the ability to get to the free throw line. Indiana's top 10 nationally in free throw rate. They force their way to the free throw line, and that number will come down a little bit once you get into conference play and you're not playing so many teams that are going to just sort of overmatch you. You're going to be so much more athletic than they are, deeper than they are, quicker than they are. But that number should largely stand up considering just kind of how capable Indiana is of getting the ball in the post and at the rim. Indiana should stay one of the most sort of most fouled teams in the country, and I think that would serve them well in any road setting. This one would be a big one because Nebraska, a big part of Nebraska's formula is not putting opponents at the free throw line. The other one, I guess, the other question you'd have would be kel'el Ware. I suspect he'll be back as well. My impression was I think Mike Woodson more or less basically said he was out sick for the Kennesaw State game. So you would imagine with about a week to recover, Ware would be ready for this game. And obviously his return will be very important at both ends of the floor. He's a defensive presence like few in the league, and he gives Indiana that real, he and Malik Renew give Indiana that real complement in the post that I think maybe makes, a team like Nebraska that might be really good defending twos, might be really good keeping teams off the free throw line, might be really good keeping the ball away from the danger areas in the lane and around the rim. If suddenly you've got two of those guys to contend with and not just the one, that makes it more difficult. The other piece of this, again, going back to Nebraska, they don't necessarily shoot the ball great statistically from three, but they've got guys like Bryce Williams, like Keisei Tominaga, who's only shooting 33.3%, but we know is a really good three-point shooter in general. They've got guys that can hurt you from three, and it's also worth saying they are 87th in the country in percentage of total points off three-pointers. So whether they're shooting threes well or not, they will probably persist with it. And it's a question of whether Indiana, which has undeniably at times struggled with its rotations, its help, how to defend certain screening actions in ways that don't leave the corner open or the opposite wing open, how Indiana manages the three-point line defensively tonight. So it's a fascinating matchup. I think it's one that both teams will probably look at and say, again, we talked about how Indiana kind of runs through the first few games back in Big Ten play. Nebraska, on the counter, really kind of needs this game. Nebraska lost ugly to Minnesota in its Big Ten opener back in December. That was a game that the Huskers led substantially. I think they led them, just like looking at it right now, they led by 17 in that game. at Minnesota, and they lost by 11. But then they backstopped that by coming home and beating Michigan State at home. They play Indiana at home on Wednesday night. Then they're at Wisconsin, home to Purdue, at Iowa, and at Rutgers before they come home to face Northwestern and Ohio State. And then they get Maryland on the road. That's the balance of January for Nebraska. If Nebraska wants to sort of find its feet and make itself an NCAA tournament kind of team, get itself in that conversation with a couple decent out-of-conference wins, nothing amazing, but Kansas State on the road will probably stand up as a decent win most of the year. Nebraska really needs to get off to a good start. And so Nebraska may look at Indiana and say, Indiana's got their own issues. This isn't necessarily the same kind of scalp to claim, so to speak, as a Michigan State. But the flip side is Nebraska is looking at a run of, 4 or 5 pretty tough games in a row here. I think they're going to look at this game and say, we have to put this one in our back pocket as a win to give ourselves the breathing room to not be staring at 2-6 in the conference coming up near the end of January. So it's a big game for both teams. It's a game that will be defined, at least in part, by where Indiana is health-wise. It's a 9 p.m. tip. It is on the Big Ten Network, so you don't need to worry about Peacocks tonight. I think Indiana's next Peacock game might be Rutgers next week. We'll talk to you between now and then. For the Indianapolis Star, I'm Zach Osterman. Thanks for watching this video. We'll see you soon.